In mid-February 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat inside his command post near the Tunisian border, writing a letter to his wife, Lucy. Outside, the Afrika Korps was celebrating. German and Italian troops had just smashed through American positions at Kasserine Pass, delivering one of the most lopsided defeats the United States Army had suffered in its short combat history of the Second World War. Inside the command post, Rommel was not celebrating. He was thinking. The battle had been decisive. Over 6 days of fighting, American forces had collapsed. More than 6,000 U.S. casualties were recorded. Entire battalions surrendered. Vehicles, artillery pieces, fuel dumps, and ammunition were abandoned in retreat. Command cohesion disintegrated. Units fled without orders. The defeat was not just tactical. It was psychological. Rommel had seen this before. In 1940, he had watched French formations disintegrate in much the same way. Units that looked formidable on paper collapsed once German armor punched through their lines. The pattern was familiar: hesitation at the top, confusion in command, panic spreading downward. What Rommel saw at Kasserine looked uncomfortably similar. In his letter to Lucy, Rommel did not soften his assessment. He wrote that the Americans were inexperienced, poorly trained at the higher levels, and led by officers who made amateur mistakes that would have resulted in court-martial in any professional European army. He noted that American soldiers fought bravely when cornered, but bravery without coordination meant little in modern warfare. The Americans, Rommel concluded, were not ready. This was not arrogance. It was observation. At Kasserine Pass, Rommel and his subordinates had watched American units react to pressure exactly as German doctrine predicted. When attacked, they tried to hold static defensive positions. When German armor concentrated against weak sectors, those positions collapsed. When the pressure increased, American units withdrew, often without coordination, creating gaps that widened into panic. Rommel understood morale as well as maneuver. He believed he had just witnessed the breaking of American confidence in real time. These were soldiers raised on stories of World War I heroism, now facing the reality of modern, mechanized warfare against one of the most experienced armies in the world. Many were asking themselves whether they belonged on a battlefield at all. Rommel's conclusion was blunt. If Germany could strike again quickly, within weeks, not months, the Americans could be driven into the sea before they had time to learn how to fight. This assessment was forwarded to Berlin. The recommendation was clear: exploit American weakness immediately. Do not give them time to adapt. The failure at Kasserine. Rommel's judgment was rooted in what German intelligence officers had carefully documented at Kasserine Pass. The failure was not one of equipment. American II Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Friedendahl, had established his headquarters nearly 70 miles behind the front lines, inside a canyon. From there, he attempted to direct a fast-moving armored battle by radio and telephone, without direct observation of the terrain or enemy movements. His orders were often contradictory. Units received conflicting instructions. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was weak or non-existent. Radio discipline collapsed under pressure. Communications clogged with panic-driven chatter. When German forces attacked, American units frequently retreated without orders, creating cascading breakdowns across the front. German intelligence officers took note. This was not an army that had faced the Wehrmacht before. These were soldiers learning warfare in real time, against veterans who had been fighting since Poland and France. Rommel calculated that it would take at least 6 months for the Americans to correct their leadership failures, and perhaps a year to develop effective combined arms doctrine. German armored doctrine, concentrating superior force at a decisive point, breaking through with armored spearheads, then exploiting the breach with mobile formations, had proven itself repeatedly since 1939. It had shattered France in 6 weeks. It had destroyed entire Soviet armies in 1941. It had driven British forces across North Africa twice. At Kasserine Pass, it had humiliated the Americans. Why would the next battle be any different? German confidence. Rommel studied the terrain around El Guetter in central Tunisia. It was open, rolling ground, well suited for armored maneuver. American units were still reeling from Kasserine, reorganizing, re-equipping, and licking their wounds. If German forces attacked there in late March, Rommel believed the psychological advantage alone would be decisive. The plan assumed several things, all of them reasonable based on German experience. First, that American forces would again defend from fixed positions. Second, that when German armor concentrated against weak points, American units would hesitate or retreat. Third, that American command and control would collapse under sustained pressure. Finally, that 3 weeks was not enough time to transform an army. Berlin approved the assessment. One more offensive, German planners believed, would break American morale completely. After that, Germany could concentrate its efforts against the British, while the Americans shipped their defeated army home. A change in command. In early March 1943, German intelligence reported a development that did not initially concern them. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. had assumed command of the American 2nd Corps on March 6th, the same formation that had collapsed at Kasserine Pass. From the German perspective, this changed little. One man could not rewrite doctrine or retrain an entire corps in 3 weeks. Patton arrived at 2 Corps headquarters like a thunderclap. He entered in a siren-blaring motorcade, wearing his trademark ivory-handled revolvers. Before issuing a single operational order, he changed the atmosphere. Discipline was immediate and visible. Soldiers were required to wear regulation uniforms, including ties and helmets, even in the desert heat. Officers who appeared improperly dressed were fined on the spot. Soldiers who failed to salute were reprimanded publicly. This was not vanity. It was psychology. Patton understood something Rommel understood as well. Discipline creates confidence. Confidence creates aggression. Aggression wins battles. German analysts believed Patton might improve morale. He might reduce sloppiness. But he could not fix systemic problems in less than a month. They were wrong. Rommel departs. Rommel's health was failing. Years of stress, exhaustion, and chronic stomach illness were taking their toll. In early March, he prepared to turn over operational command in Tunisia to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Before leaving, Rommel reviewed the planned attack at El Guetter one final time. The assumptions remained unchanged. The Americans would defend passively. They would hesitate under pressure. They would retreat when German armor pressed forward. On March 9, 1943, Rommel flew to Germany on sick leave. He would never return to Africa. 3 weeks later, German forces prepared to launch the offensive that would test every one of his assumptions. March 23, 1943, El Guetter. Dawn broke over the hills near El Guetter on March 23, 1943. German forces advanced with confidence. The attack force included the veteran 10th Panzer Division, equipped primarily with Panzer IV tanks mounting long-barreled 75mm guns, supported by the Italian Centauro Armored Division. The terrain was favorable. Visibility was good. Everything aligned with the operational plan. At 6 a.m., the attack began. German commanders expected resistance. They expected American artillery to fire sporadically. They expected disorganized defense. What they did not expect was what came next. American artillery opened fire. Not ranging shots, not scattered barrages, time-on-target salvos. At a prearranged second, dozens of American artillery batteries fired simultaneously. Shells from miles apart landed on German formations at the same instant. For German infantry and tank crews, it felt as if the ground itself had erupted. This was not improvisation. It was system. American artillery coordination, supported by reliable communications and enormous ammunition supply, achieved a level of concentrated fire the Germans could not easily match. Tanks took direct hits. Infantry units suffered heavy casualties before they could deploy. German commanders ordered the advance to continue. This was expected resistance. Americans would break once pressure increased. They did not. Patton arrived at 2 Corps headquarters like a thunderclap. He entered in a siren-blaring motorcade, wearing his trademark ivory-handled revolvers. Before issuing a single operational order, he changed the atmosphere. Discipline was immediate and visible. Soldiers were required to wear regulation uniforms, including ties and helmets, even in the desert heat. Officers who appeared improperly dressed were fined on the spot. Soldiers who failed to salute were reprimanded publicly. This was not vanity. It was psychology. Patton understood something Rommel understood as well. Discipline creates confidence. Confidence creates aggression. Aggression wins battles. German analysts believed Patton might improve morale. He might reduce sloppiness. But he could not fix systemic problems in less than a month. They were wrong. Rommel departs. Rommel's health was failing. Years of stress, exhaustion, and chronic stomach illness were taking their toll. In early March, he prepared to turn over operational command in Tunisia to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Before leaving, Rommel reviewed the planned attack at El Gueter one final time. The assumptions remained unchanged. The Americans would defend passively. They would hesitate under pressure. They would retreat when German armor pressed forward. On March 9, 1943, Rommel flew to Germany on sick leave. He would never return to Africa. 3 weeks later, German forces prepared to launch the offensive that would test every one of his assumptions. March 23, 1943, El Gueter. Dawn broke over the hills near El Gueter on March 23, 1943. German forces advanced with confidence. The attack force included the veteran 10th Panzer Division, equipped primarily with Panzer IV tanks mounting long-barreled 75 mm guns, supported by the Italian Centauro Armored Division. The terrain was favorable. Visibility was good. Everything aligned with the operational plan. At 6 a.m., the attack began. German commanders expected resistance. They expected American artillery to fire sporadically. They expected disorganized defense. What they did not expect was what came next. American artillery opened fire. Not ranging shots, not scattered barrages, time-on-target salvos. At a prearranged second, dozens of American artillery batteries fired simultaneously. Shells from miles apart landed on German formations at the same instant. For German infantry and tank crews, it felt as if the ground itself had erupted. This was not improvisation. It was system. American artillery coordination, supported by reliable communications and enormous ammunition supply, achieved a level of concentrated fire the Germans could not easily match. Tanks took direct hits. Infantry units suffered heavy casualties before they could deploy. German commanders ordered the advance to continue. This was expected resistance. Americans would break once pressure increased. They did not. As the first time-on-target salvos lifted, German commanders ordered the 10th Panzer Division to push forward through the barrage and close with American positions. This was the decisive moment German doctrine had relied on for years. Absorb the initial fire, maintain momentum, and smash through the defender before resistance could reorganize. What unfolded instead was something unfamiliar. American tank destroyers opened fire from concealed positions, not from obvious hull-down lines, but from staggered, mutually supporting locations that created overlapping fields of fire. As Panzer IVs advanced, they were hit from oblique angles. Vehicles that turned to face one threat exposed their flanks to another. German crews reported being engaged simultaneously from multiple directions. This was not accidental. The Americans had prepared the ground. American infantry units of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, held their forward positions under fire, not because they were ordered to die in place, but because they were part of a layered defense. When pressure increased beyond a predetermined threshold, they withdrew deliberately to secondary positions that had already been reconnoitered and prepared. Each withdrawal forced German armor to advance into fresh kill zones. By mid-morning, German spearheads had penetrated roughly 2,000 yards into American-held ground. Under normal circumstances, this would have signaled the beginning of a breakthrough. At Kasserine Pass, such penetration had triggered collapse. At El Gueter, it did not. American units did not flee. They repositioned. Radio intercepts captured by German Intelligence revealed a striking difference in tone compared to February. American communications were calm, concise, and professional. Officers issued clear orders. Units reported contact, ammunition status, and fields of fire. Artillery observers adjusted fire with precision. The psychological shift was unmistakable. The Italian flank. On the German right flank, the Italian Centauro Armored Division advanced with the expectation that American resistance would be lighter. Instead, they encountered disciplined, well-sighted defenses. American machine gun teams established interlocking fire zones. When Italian infantry attempted to advance, they were pinned down. When armored elements pushed forward, American anti-tank weapons engaged them from covered positions. Italian commanders reported unexpectedly heavy resistance. Requests for artillery support increased. Casualties mounted without measurable progress. For the first time in the Tunisian campaign, Axis commanders were facing an American force that behaved like a professional combined arms formation rather than a collection of inexperienced units. German assumptions fail. At his headquarters, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim studied incoming reports with growing concern. The attack was not unfolding as planned. Casualties were rising. Momentum was fading. On May 13, 1943, the Axis position in North Africa collapsed. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. It was one of the largest mass capitulations in military history. The North African campaign was over. Transformation confirmed. The American army that surrendered at Kasserine Pass in February was gone by May. German commanders understood this. Post-battle assessments circulated within the Wehrmacht acknowledged that American forces had become a fundamentally different opponent. They combined overwhelming material resources with aggressive, flexible doctrine. Static defense against them was no longer viable. The implications extended far beyond Tunisia. Sicily, the proof of transformation. The surrender in Tunisia did not merely end a campaign. It marked the end of an illusion. German commanders no longer viewed American forces as a temporary problem or an unseasoned auxiliary to the British. They now faced a new reality. The United States Army had absorbed its early defeat and converted it into operational competence with alarming speed. The next test came almost immediately. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The operation was vast in scale, involving American, British, and Canadian troops, supported by overwhelming naval and air power. For the Germans, Sicily offered an opportunity to evaluate whether the American performance in Tunisia had been situational or structural. General George S. Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army. The men under his command were no longer the uncertain formations of early 1943. They were veterans of Tunisia. They had learned how to coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. They had learned how to move fast, exploit weakness, and maintain pressure. German defenders on Sicily quickly noticed the difference. German reports from Sicily. German after-action reports described American attacks as aggressive, flexible, and relentless. Where British forces tended to pause to consolidate gains, American units pushed forward continuously. When German rearguards attempted to delay the advance, American artillery and armor responded with immediate concentration of fire. American logistics proved decisive. Supplies moved forward rapidly. Ammunition shortages rarely slowed operations. When resistance stiffened, American commanders did not hesitate to bring overwhelming force to bear. Patton drove his forces hard. He demanded speed. He punished hesitation. Officers who failed to maintain momentum were relieved. Units that advanced rapidly were praised publicly. The psychological framework, established after Kasserine, was now embedded throughout the Army. On August 17, 1943, American forces entered Messina, completing the conquest of Sicily. Patton's 7th Army arrived ahead of British forces, winning a race that had both strategic and symbolic importance. German commanders took note. The Americans were no longer learning. They were executing German doctrine under pressure. The campaigns in Tunisia and Sicily forced German military thinkers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their doctrine, which relied on qualitative superiority, initiative at lower levels, and tactical brilliance, was being neutralized by an enemy that emphasized coordination, mass, and speed. American artillery doctrine, in particular, was proving devastating. Time-on-target strikes allowed American forces to achieve effects that previously required prolonged bombardment. German units found themselves under sudden, crushing fire without warning. Hiedig! AC? Equally troubling was American adaptability. Weaknesses identified by German commanders were often corrected within weeks. Defensive measures that worked once rarely worked twice. This rate of adaptation was unprecedented in German experience. Rommel's return to command. In late 1943 and early 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel returned to operational command, this time in Western Europe. His task was to prepare German forces to repel an Allied invasion of France. Rommel's assessment of American forces had changed completely since February 1943. He no longer viewed them as soft or inexperienced. Instead, he described them as aggressive, technically proficient, and dangerously effective when properly led. In private correspondence and staff discussions, Rommel noted that American units combined material superiority with a doctrine that emphasized constant pressure. Rommel understood that once Americans established momentum, stopping them would be extraordinarily difficult. Defending against America, Rommel argued that the invasion had to be stopped at the beaches. He believed that American forces, once ashore, would advance inland rapidly, supported by overwhelming firepower. German mobile reserves, he insisted, had to be positioned close to likely landing sites so they could counterattack immediately. This assessment reflected Rommel's experience in North Africa. He had seen what happened when Americans were given time to coordinate and mass their forces. Hitler disagreed. The German High Command split authority over armored reserves. Panzer divisions were held back, requiring direct authorization to move. When the invasion came, this delay would prove fatal. June 6, 1944. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Rommel's fears were realized. Despite heavy casualties, American forces at Utah and Omaha beaches pushed inland aggressively. They did not pause. They did not wait for perfect conditions. Artillery, naval gunfire, and air support were coordinated on an unprecedented scale. Once beachheads were secured, American units expanded them rapidly, denying German forces the opportunity to organize decisive counterattacks. Rommel understood immediately what many of his colleagues still underestimated. The Americans landing in Normandy were not the army of Kasserine Pass. They were the army of El Guettar, Sicily, and Tunisia. After Germany's surrender, Allied interrogators questioned senior German commanders about their experiences fighting American forces. The testimony was consistent and revealing. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded panzer forces against American armies in 1944 and 1945, stated that American forces learned faster than any opponent Germany had faced. Mistakes were corrected quickly. Successful tactics were reinforced immediately. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring described American artillery coordination as the most effective he encountered in 6 years of war. The speed with which Americans could concentrate fire made traditional German defensive tactics obsolete. German officers emphasized that American effectiveness did not stem from individual brilliance alone. It stemmed from systems, logistics, communications, coordination, and leadership. By 1945, German commanders no longer spoke of American softness. They spoke of American inevitability. The same army that had collapsed at Kasserine Pass had become one of the most formidable fighting forces in history. Leadership mattered more than experience. Doctrine mattered more than equipment. Aggression, properly directed, mattered more than technical superiority. The Germans built better tanks. The Americans built better doctrine. When the two met, doctrine won. The 90-day transformation. The distance between Kasserine Pass and the surrender in Tunisia was measured not in miles, but in time. 90 days separated humiliation from victory. In military history, transformations of that scale usually take years. Armies traditionally learn slowly, painfully, and at enormous cost. The United States Army did something different in 1943. It learned at speed. Kasserine Pass exposed every weakness the American Army possessed. Leadership failures were obvious. Doctrine was untested. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was inadequate. Communications collapsed under pressure. Morale cracked when command coherence disappeared. None of these failures were hidden. What made the American response unique was not denial, but acceptance. Senior commanders did not explain the defeat away as bad luck or overwhelming enemy strength. They treated it as evidence of what had to change. Within days of the defeat, command was reorganized. Leadership standards were raised. Officers who could not perform under pressure were removed. Those who demonstrated aggression and clarity were promoted. George Patton did not invent American doctrine. He enforced it. That distinction mattered. The American solution was not to chase German technical superiority. The United States did not attempt to outbuild the Panzer IV with a heavier tank in 1943. It did not attempt to match German tactical finesse at the individual level. Instead, it emphasized what it could do better than anyone else: coordination. American doctrine focused on integrating every arm of combat into a single system. Infantry did not fight alone. Armor did not advance unsupported. Artillery was not an auxiliary weapon. It was the backbone of the battlefield. Time-on-target fire missions embodied this philosophy. They were not impressive because of innovation alone, but because they reflected a system that functioned under pressure. Communications worked. Observers were trained. Ammunition was available in vast quantities. German soldiers did not experience American firepower as isolated engagements. They experienced it as an environment. Aggression as policy. American units were taught that defense did not mean endurance. It meant disruption. When attacked, units were expected to counterattack locally. When pressure increased, they were expected to maneuver rather than freeze. Hesitation was punished. Aggression was rewarded. This did not produce recklessness. It produced initiative. Officers learned that waiting for perfect conditions meant surrendering momentum. Soldiers learned that controlled violence, applied quickly, reduced casualties rather than increasing them. By El Guitar, this mindset had taken root. By Tunisia's end, it was permanent. German misreading. Rommel's original assessment in February 1943 was logical. Every previous opponent Germany had faced required long periods to adapt. The French never recovered. The early Soviet army required years of brutal attrition. Even British forces improved slowly. The Americans broke the pattern. German intelligence failed not because it misunderstood American weakness, but because it underestimated American learning capacity. German planners assumed time was on their side. It was not. By the time German commanders realized the change was structural rather than temporary, the opportunity to exploit American inexperience had vanished. The arsenal finds its sword. The phrase "arsenal of democracy" captured America's industrial role in the war. Factories produced tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition in quantities unmatched by any nation in history. Kasserine Pass revealed the missing element: doctrine. Once the American Army aligned its industrial power with aggressive operational thinking, the result was overwhelming. Firepower was no longer wasted. Logistics no longer lagged behind maneuver. Command decisions accelerated rather than slowed operations. The arsenal had found its sword. A change felt across Europe, from Sicily to Normandy, from the hedgerows of France to the plains of Germany. The pattern established in Tunisia repeated itself. American forces advanced rapidly. When stopped, they massed fire. When checked, they maneuvered around resistance rather than battering it blindly. German commanders adjusted their defenses repeatedly, but the fundamental imbalance could not be corrected. They lacked the fuel, the air superiority, and the logistical depth to fight a war of continuous reaction. American forces dictated tempo. Tempo became destiny. In post-war interrogations, German generals no longer spoke with contempt. They spoke with respect, edged by frustration. They had faced armies that were brave. They had faced armies that were numerous. They had never faced an army that learned so quickly. The American Army of 1945 was not the product of tradition. It was the product of adaptation. It was built in combat, refined under pressure, and guided by leaders who understood that modern war rewarded speed of thought as much as speed of movement. Kasserine Pass was not the beginning of American failure. It was the beginning of American effectiveness. The 90 days between February and May 1943 altered the trajectory of the conflict. They marked the point at which the United States ceased to be a junior partner learning war on the margins and became a central force shaping how the war would be fought. From that point forward, German commanders planned not around what Americans might do, but around what they were certain Americans would do. Advance aggressively, concentrate fire, and deny the enemy time to recover. The soldier across the foxhole was no longer a tourist. He was a professional. He was the instrument of an industrial democracy that had learned how to fight.